Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the beginning of the end. My name is Will Crichton, and I'm an incoming assistant professor at Brown. This paper is part of a broader project that I did during my postdoc with Shriram. And the core question of that project was, how do we help people learn Rust? We focused specifically on an online textbook called, quote, The Rust Programming Language, end quote, more colloquially just the Rust book. And so, especially outside of the university setting, learn Rust by reading the Rust book. And so we were interested in how to make that book better. But specifically, we wanted to be systematic in how we improve learnability. That is, not just using our intuition as educators and programmers, but rather developing methods that other people could use themselves, ideally for languages other than Rust. And now we've done two major projects in this space, taking basically a depth or breadth first approach. So last year at OOPSLA, I presented a grounded conceptual model for ownership types in Rust. And that paper was about taking a specific language feature, ownership, that we already know is hard, and then doing a deep dive into it. But that depth-oriented approach relied on us starting off knowing that ownership was hard. And this current paper is a more breadth-oriented exploration of Rust learnability, meaning how can we look at Rust holistically and identify learning challenges in any areas of the language, especially areas we might not expect. Now, our basic approach was pretty simple. We went through each chapter of the Rust book, like this one on screen, and we put in these little quizzes. So we encourage readers to attempt the quizzes in order to check their understanding. And each quiz is usually 2 to 4 questions. We have about 1 to 2 quizzes per page. If you click Start, then a little box pops up and asks you a question, like the keyword for declaring a new function in Rust is fin. Thank you. Fin. Once you submit your answer, then you get feedback. Thunk, get out of here. Fin. In total, we wrote 221 questions distributed throughout the book. We put up the quizzical version of the Rust book at this URL that I've repeated now probably 1,000 times in my life, rust-book.cs.brown.edu. Now, to get people to answer these questions, we asked the Rust book authors to put this advertisement for our experiment in the actual Rust book, which went live in November of 2022. And then people read the book. When we submitted the paper at this time last year, we had 62,526 people answering questions 1,140,020 times. Pretty cool. And however, life did not stop for the OOPSLA review cycle. Those numbers have about doubled in the intervening year, so people continue to read it to this very day, maybe even right now. But amassing this data set was just the first step. The core contribution of this paper is analyzing and applying this data. Specifically, we investigated 4 research questions. What kinds of trajectories do readers take through the book? What are the characteristics of a high-quality PL quiz question? How can a learning profile be used to improve a PL learning resource? And how applicable is this methodology to languages with smaller user bases? Now for this talk, I'm going to mostly focus on the middle 2 questions in reverse order, but I'll briefly touch on the other 2 at the end. So, starting with RQ3. Our basic idea was to try out the following pipeline. First, we write and deploy quizzes into the textbook. And we wrote questions that ideally were answerable from the contents of the textbook. They weren't designed to be super hard. Then we wait and gather answers, usually about 2 weeks in our setting to get enough data for a given question. Then we look out across the entire data set and ask, where are people struggling? For a given difficult question, we look at the corresponding section of the textbook, as well as people's incorrect answers, and we conjecture why are readers getting a particular question wrong. And then we measure whether it worked, get ahead of myself. First, we deploy an intervention based on that conjecture out to the textbook, and we measure the efficacy of that intervention by whether or not quiz scores go up or down after we've deployed it into the wild. And if that doesn't work, we revisit our conjectures and try again. Now, we use the metaphor of performance profiling to describe this whole process because we're nerds. It's like, well, if you're not sure where your hotspot is, then you gather these lightweight samples that in the aggregate help you find the problematic part of your blank, whether that's a program or a textbook. That's the idea. Now, to make this all concrete, I will walk you through a specific example. So here is one of the quiz questions in the book. Let's read it together. It says, consider the variables S2 and S3 in the following program. These two variables will be located in memory within the stack frame for main. Each variable has a size in memory on the stack, not including the size of pointed data. Which statement is true about the sizes of S2 and S3? S3 has fewer bytes than S2. S3 has the same number of bytes as S2. S3 has more bytes than S2. How many votes do we have for answer 1? S3 has fewer bytes. 0 votes, or perhaps many puzzled faces. How many people think it's the same? S3 is the same number of bytes. All right, we got a handful of hands, and then S3 has more bytes. A smaller number of hands. Okay, a handful of hands. So concretely, S is in Rust a capital S owned string. S2 is a reference to a capital S owned string. And then S3 is a reference to a lowercase s stir, also called a string slice. And the idea is that a string slice is a special fat pointer that also contains the length of the object that it points to. So the correct answer is actually S3 has more bytes than S2. Now this question came to our attention because only 23% of readers got it right. A non-trivial fraction of readers had both misconceptions. And after reading back through the book, we conjectured that this was in part due to the explanation of string slices. So the original textbook used the following example of a string S containing hello world, and then 2 slices, hello and world, visualized with this diagram that shows S, the owned string, and world, the slice, pointing to the string. So we this, however, does not show a reference to a capital S owned string. And so we conjectured that learners saw this diagram and made one of 2 inferences. Either and string is the same as string, as well as S is bigger than world, therefore and string is bigger than and stir. Or perhaps and string is the same as and stir, therefore the 2 types are naturally the same size. Both of these misconceptions should be fixable by showing that and capital S string is a distinct object from either type. So compared to the original, we modified the example to introduce an owned string reference. As shown here, S2 equals and S. And we modified the diagram to show each kind of pointer. Now learners could see the relative sizes of all 3 types, the owned capital string S with type capital S string, 3 fields, then the string slice with 2 fields, and the plain reference with 1 field. After deploying this change to the textbook and waiting for another few weeks, we saw that the original question scores, originally at 23%, increased by 20 percentage points to 43%, which corresponded to an evenly split decrease in both of the distractors. So that's a successful example of the profiling process at work. We ended up doing 12 interventions across a range of topics shown in the left column of the table. We covered topics from semantic versioning to inheritance to lifetimes to macros, and our interventions mostly worked, 10 out of 12 times. Across all the interventions, we found on average we could improve a given question score with a relatively small change to the textbook by 20 percentage points, with an average effect size of Cohen's d equals 0.45. Now, I think there's 2 major caveats to this result. First, not all the interventions worked. Sometimes you misunderstand the learning issue, or perhaps you design an ineffective intervention. In those cases, you have to switch from the depth first mode into the breadth mode, like we describe in our other paper. Go check that out. The second caveat is that this approach is only as effective as your quiz questions. And so that's why we also wanted to investigate what are the characteristics of a high-quality PL quiz question. There's a whole bunch of science for this, called psychometrics, specifically item response theory. So in IRT, the goal is to measure what's called a latent trait in a person, such as, say, someone's understanding of Rust. To measure that trait, we use a test, or an instrument, which contains a series of questions, or items. Item response theory defines different models of the following construct: the probability of a latent trait in a person conditioned on their answers to the instrument. Now, all of you know the most basic model of this, classical test theory, which says the probability of that latent trait is exactly your score on the test. But IRT is about coming up with better models by understanding the different characteristics of an item. So one common IRT model is that an item has 3 main characteristics. There is difficulty, or the level of ability required to correctly answer a question, discrimination of how well a question distinguishes ability, and then the baseline probability of a correct random guess. And for our purposes, the dimension that most closely corresponds to quality is discrimination. So the simplest model of discrimination is the correlation between how people answer a given question and how well they do on the entire corpus of questions. And so the idea is that if that correlation is high, then correctly answering a question says something more meaningful about your overall ability. And so we asked, then what distinguishes high and low discrimination questions in our data set? Using this sort of simple correlation model, we found one interesting result that I'll share now. So I'm going to show you two types of questions we asked about Rust's type system. One type of question presents a program and asks, does this compile? Yes or no? Here the answer is no, because an operation violates the rules of ownership. In another type of question, we present a program and ask, this doesn't compile, why not? And the reader selects from one of several potential reasons. Now, I think there's a reasonable case for both of these question types. The first kind, the yes or no, is about reasoning from first principles, and you have to sort of play the type checker in your head. And then the second question is a little bit more about detecting whether you might have, say, common misconceptions if the distractors are well designed. But what we found very consistently across our whole data set is that the yes-no questions had among the lowest discrimination of any question, and while the why not questions had among the highest discrimination of every kind of question that we asked in the entirety of the Rust book. And so my hypothesis here is that the yes-no framing prompts people to use their dumb lizard brains to very quickly answer questions by pattern matching from prior experience. Many of these programs that don't compile look like they would compile if they were in any other language, so people go, oh, okay, then I'll interpret it using the semantics I expect. But then, oh, oops, I got it wrong. So it ends up being kind of a gotcha. Like, it leads skilled people to make dumb mistakes. But the why not questions, I hypothesize, force people to slow down and reason more carefully, and therefore their answers are more reflective of their true understanding. Now, you might care about this result because I hypothesize this is probably true outside of Rust. Like, if you replicated this comparison in OCaml, Haskell, or Java, or whatever, I think it's more likely than not to observe the same effect. Like, part of the value and the goal in this work is trying to find evidence for theoretical ideas, like theoretical in the psychological sense, that can inform the design of quiz questions in other languages. So, if you're writing your own test, consider the why not question instead of the whether question. Now, that's just one example of how we looked at question quality. I want to briefly mention the other two research questions. So, what kinds of trajectories do readers take through the book? That is summarized in this histogram, where the x-axis is the chapter where a given reader last answered a question, and the y-axis is the count. And focus on the blue bars. The main thing you'll notice is that most people drop out after chapter 4, and that happens to be in Rust, the ownership chapter. So the idea is that if the textbook authors wanted to focus on improving people's motivation to continue through the textbook, the data suggests this would be an important place to start, is by understanding, well, obviously it's to some extent because we expect the concept is hard, but if there were ways to improve people's motivation to sort of smoothen this curve, that would be more ideal than such a hard cutoff. Our final research question, how applicable is this methodology to languages with user bases smaller than Rust? I want this work to be useful to everyone in this room, not just us. But most PL research happens on languages smaller than Rust. So we estimated applicability by simulating different sizes of readerships. So we did that by randomly subsampling our actual data and then comparing the difference between statistics computed on the random sample and the full sample. So like what this plot is showing, the y-axis is the average error in the estimation of a question's difficulty. So like 0.2 means your average estimation is 20 percentage points off of the true difficulty. The shaded region is 1 standard deviation from the mean. And generally what we found is that 1,000 readers, definitely enough to estimate most of our statistics with very low error. 100 readers, enough to get a coarse estimate that is likely useful but imprecise. 10 readers, you need more data. So even for relatively small languages, we do think you can use embedded quizzes to get a good sense of learning outcomes for your readers, so long as it is used by more than just, a small handful of students. Now, I'll leave up some takeaways while we discuss, and I just want to otherwise mention the quiz plugin that we made for our textbook is free and open source if you would like to try it out. Otherwise, thank you for listening. Yeah.
Hi, I promised you a question, so here I am. So I was wondering, you said that the why not questions have the highest discrimination. And when I was thinking about it, as you were showing it, I was thinking, if I don't fully if I haven't internalized something yet and I don't understand it fully, and you tell me it doesn't compile and ask me why not, it's kind of prompting me to rationalize in a way that I usually maybe wouldn't take if you asked me the yes or no question, and then assuming that I actually want to answer it, would have to sit down and not assuming the solution, rationalizing my way through it. I feel like that, I don't know if that path is the safest one to take, so I was wondering if you were thinking about that, and yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that framing. I think that is another, or sort of part of the same conjecture I have as to why we observe this high discrimination. I do think, more broadly, it would be interesting. The way I imagine people should take these results is if you wanted to say, all right, we see some general statistical trend, that's just a number. If you want to actually understand what that number entails, that would require some more targeted interventions. Like, it would be interesting to have students answer both questions and reason aloud while they're doing that. And I think you might find evidence to support either my conjecture or your conjecture or something in between. So it's a little hard to say which one you would find, but I think that would be the logical next step if we wanted to dig deeper.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, excellent talk. Thank you so much for sharing this information with us. I read your version of the book I think a couple of years ago. I really enjoyed it. First, a clarifying question. If I remember correctly, there were also more like open-ended questions where you could like type in code. Is that right?
So there are short answer questions where we do exact or case-insensitive string matching. We haven't tried doing anything in the book where, for instance, you would write a whole program and, for instance, run that against tests. Everything that is in the actual book is close-ended.
Okay. So so your presentation kind of covered like these different kinds of like multiple choice questions. Do you think are there any kind of maybe different takeaways or maybe challenges that you faced with the more short answer open-ended questions that's different from the multiple choice ones?
Right. So, the core issue with the open-ended questions is that you need some means of automatically grading them, or at least ideally you do. That's the important part of the multiple choice stuff, is that both the readers get immediate feedback as well as we can automatically grade their responses, so we can plug them into all these nice statistical models. If you give an open-ended response, you need some other way of deducing correctness, and that really depends on the kind of question you're asking. I think one model of this, if your goal is to do qualitative analysis, is plug again. The paper I published last year, we did basically what you're saying, where we were trying to understand people's misconceptions of ownership. We gave them ownership-related problems that were open-ended. We had them write down, they're like, oh, this is why I think this program is failing, and so on. And then we just interpreted manually sort of their what they wrote so as to better characterize their misconceptions. I think that's what I would do if I wanted to go deeper. But I do think there's an interesting question of, is there some sort of halfway point where you either have fully quantitative or fully qualitative analyses? Ideally, you would be able to interpolate that. But right now, those are two distinct silos.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Hi, this is super cool work. I was wondering if you could shed... Thanks. If you could shed some more light on like how you developed like the why not questions, because I guess did you ever run into a scenario where you kind of found out that you had missed like one of the misconceptions that people were having, and like how did you kind of like realize that maybe you've come to saturation in terms of all the possibilities?
Yeah, so in this setting, we really don't get... The only way we can recognize whether or not there's a misconception we haven't discovered is if I see a problem and I think, say, it's almost suspiciously correct, like people seem to be getting it correct too often, I might say, or if any just distractor has a sufficiently low probability of getting selected, you might say, well, that's a bad distractor. You could go in and try to speculate whether there's a different one. But it's very difficult to discover in the data like this, especially from multiple choice questions, some sort of unknown or unstated misconception, especially if that leads them to the correct answer. Or conversely, I mean, as you saw in Casey's talk, like even a given wrong answer might correspond to several misconceptions, so we can't necessarily diagnose between either of those. I'll go back to the answer to the previous question as well. I think qualitative analysis is really important if you want this deeper understanding of when people are interpreting this code or interpreting this type error, and they get it wrong. Why are they getting it wrong? What is the misconception that led to that? So for all of these questions, I really just used my brain. I was like, well, here's all the ways I think someone might misinterpret it, but that's not very replicable. And I think stuff like Casey showed is actually a good future step to trying to remove some of the human bias in the generation of those distractors.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for this talk. I had a question about the distinguishability or discrimination, that criterion of the item response theory. One thing that I've always struggled with when attempting to utilize item response theory in my own work is the difficulty of getting ground truth for what the student the actual level of understanding, right? So distinguishability says, how effectively do the answers to this question actually correspond to differences in the underlying levels of student understanding? And it feels like the only ways to really get that are either via some kind of quiz, which is going through the exact same mechanism that you're trying to ostensibly evaluate, or with some combination of like self-reporting, which seems pretty susceptible to metacognitive biases. So I'm curious if you could comment on what you did in this situation, and in general, if you have like thoughts on how this particular methodology can be used effectively by PL researchers. Yeah,
so I think it depends on how you model discrimination. So like in this paper, we consider two models, one being the just classic correlation. And I think that's a decent place to start, to say, does someone's responses on this question correlate with their questions across the whole test? And that, of course, is assuming that the whole test tells you something interesting about their Rust ability, but that's kind of what you're assuming a little bit, that there's something in the mix that's useful. The other thing we explored is like doing sort of essentially variational inference to fit the more sophisticated probabilistic model to the data, so that way you can like learn the discrimination parameters and try to tease that out just by which works well for us because we have 1 million data points, and so there's, I think, enough structure in the data that if you run that inference and it seems to be a relatively explanatory model, then you're learning something interesting. And we did find that, like, I didn't have time to talk about it here, but you do find meaningful differences between the kind of discrimination learned via correlation versus via fitting this probabilistic model. Like, it tells you a little bit something more. Because, for instance, what you're talking about of, like, is this telling me something about someone's ability in general versus is this question telling me something about how discriminatory it is at a given level of difficulty? I think the latter is what fitting the probabilistic model really helps you understand, whereas the correlation is essentially a more coarse-grained statistic. So I guess my final answer would be, I think computing both of these statistics, making and sort of analyzing them separately and understanding like how to interpret them correctly is really the key thing, and also just making sure you have enough data to do this. The other thing we found is that discrimination was the metric that required the most data in order to get, like difficulty, for instance, wasn't that hard to estimate accurately, but you need a lot of readers to accurately estimate discrimination to the degree that we did. So that's the other side of it.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. That's Splash.